On October 20th, 2011, a video started spreading across the world. Not a polished news clip, not something planned, just raw chaotic footage. A man surrounded by a crowd, shouting and confusion everywhere. People pulling him, pushing him, and in the middle of all that was Muammar Gaddafi. A man who just months before that moment was still the leader of Libya. A man who had ruled for over 40 years. 4 decades in power, and then suddenly he's hiding in a drainage pipe trying to escape. And then just like that, he's captured and beaten, and hours later, he's dead. It didn't feel like a normal ending. There was no clear explanation, no single agreed version of what really happened. Some people said he was killed by angry rebels. Others believed, no, this was planned from the beginning. And then there are those who think the truth is somewhere in between. Because when you really step back and look at it, Gaddafi wasn't just any leader. This was someone who controlled massive oil wealth, challenged powerful countries openly, and had survived decades of pressure, sanctions, and isolation. So for someone like that to fall this quickly and this violently, you have to ask yourself one simple question. Was this just the end of a leader, or was this something much bigger? And if it was bigger, then the real question becomes who actually wanted him gone and what really happened in 2011. Now, if you ask people about Gaddafi, they'll immediately jump to 2011, the protests, the war, and his death. But that's like watching the last 10 minutes of a movie and thinking you understand the whole story. Because the truth is, this didn't start in 2011, not even close. To really understand this, you have to go back more than 40 years, back to a completely different Libya, back to 1969. At that time, Libya wasn't what you might expect. Yes, the country had oil, but the system wasn't really working for everyone. The king at the time, King Idris, was in power, but many young people felt disconnected from the government. There was frustration. There was a sense that things could be better. And right in the middle of that environment was a young military officer, just 27 years old, Muammar Gaddafi. Now imagine this for a second. You are young, you believe your country can be better, and you are inside the military. You already know how power works, so instead of waiting for change, you decide to force it. On September 1st, 1969, Gaddafi and a group of officers carried out a coup. No long political campaign, no elections. Within hours, the government was gone and Gaddafi was in control. This wasn't seen as a bad thing at the time. In fact, many people supported it because to them, this looked like a fresh start. A young leader, new ideas, a chance to rebuild the country, and honestly, in the early years, it looked like it was working. Once Gaddafi took power, he didn't act like a typical leader. He didn't just sit back and maintain the system. He started changing things fast. One of the biggest moves he made was taking control of Libya's oil, because oil was and still is the backbone of Libya's economy. Before that, foreign companies had a lot of influence, but Gaddafi changed that. He made sure more of that money stayed inside the country, and then he started using it. Education became free, healthcare became free, housing support was introduced. There were even programs where newly married couples received financial help. So from the perspective of an average Libyan citizen at the time, life was improving. And this is where the story becomes complicated, because depending on who you ask, Gaddafi was either a hero who improved his country, or a leader who was slowly building too much control, and both views existed at the same time. Inside Libya, many people respected him, but outside Libya, especially in Western countries, there was growing concern. Because Gaddafi wasn't just improving his country, he was also speaking very boldly on the global stage. He criticized powerful nations, he pushed for African unity, he even suggested creating a single African currency backed by gold. Now pause there for a second, because that's not a small idea. That's the kind of idea that can shift power globally. And when a leader starts talking like that, people start paying attention, and not always in a good way. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the relationship between Libya and Western countries had changed completely. This was no longer just a leader doing his own thing. Gaddafi had become controversial on a global level. There were accusations that Libya was supporting different armed groups around the world. Some governments labeled him dangerous, others saw him as unpredictable. And then came one of the biggest turning points, December 21st, 1988, Panam Flight 103. A passenger plane exploded over Lochaber, Scotland. 270 people lost their lives, and very quickly, attention turned towards Libya. Over time, Libya accepted responsibility in a complicated agreement years later, but even today, there are still debates about what really happened. At that moment, one thing became clear. Gaddafi was now seen as a global problem. Sanctions were placed on Libya. The country became isolated. Pressure increased year after year. Despite all of that, Gaddafi didn't fall. He stayed in power through pressure, through criticism, and through isolation for decades. A leader survives all of that for over 40 years, and then suddenly in 2011, everything collapses. So what changed? Why did something that couldn't break him for decades finally bring him down? That's where the real story begins. Alright, now we are getting to the part where everything starts to shift, because for years, even decades, it looked like nothing could really remove Muammar Gaddafi from power. Pressure didn't work, sanctions didn't work, and criticism didn't work either. So what changed in 2011? To understand that, you have to look at what was happening across an entire region, not just Libya. At the end of 2010, something started in a country called Tunisia. It didn't start with politicians. It didn't start with a big speech. It started with one man, a street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi. After years of frustration, harassment, and feeling ignored by the system, he set himself on fire in protest. And that moment sparked something no one fully expected. Protests began to spread, not just in Tunisia, but across the region. Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and so on. This wave became known as the Arab Spring, and the idea behind it was simple. People were tired of long-standing leaders, tired of corruption, tired of feeling like nothing would ever change. Now, when this wave reached Libya in early 2011, at first, it didn't look like something that would bring down Gaddafi. Because remember, this wasn't a weak leader. This was someone who had been in control for over 40 years, someone who had survived international pressure. So when protests began around February 2011, especially in cities like Benghazi, a lot of people didn't expect it to go very far. But this time, something was different. The protests didn't just stay as protests, they escalated fast. Clashes began between protesters and government forces, and very quickly, this turned into something much bigger than demonstrations. It was starting to look like a civil war. Now here's where things get complicated, because depending on who you listen to, you hear different versions of what happened next. Some say the government responded too aggressively, trying to crush the protests before they could spread. Others say the situation was already spiraling out of control and both sides were escalating. But one thing is clear, the situation didn't calm down, it intensified instead. Cities started falling out of government control, armed groups began forming, and suddenly, this wasn't just people protesting anymore, this was a country dividing. And then the world started paying attention. Because once a situation like this becomes unstable, especially in a country with oil, it doesn't stay local for long. International headlines started focusing on Libya, reports were coming out, images were spreading, and the pressure began to build again, but this time, not just economically, politically, militarily, and globally. And this is where the situation takes another turn, because once outside forces start getting involved, the story changes completely. What started as protest was now becoming an international issue. And when that happens, the question is no longer just about the leader, it becomes about interest, power, and control also. So by early 2011, Libya was no longer stable. The country was splitting, the government was under pressure, and Gaddafi for the first time in decades was no longer fully in control. And once that happens, everything becomes unpredictable, because now the question isn't will something happen, it becomes how far will this go, and more importantly, who is going to step in next. Now, this is where the whole situation in Libya stops being just a local problem and starts becoming something much bigger. Because once the fighting inside the country intensified, the outside world didn't just sit and watch, they stepped in. But the real question is why? Because if we are being honest, there were protests happening in different countries at the same time. So why did Libya turn into a full international intervention? Why Libya? Now, officially, the explanation was about protection. Reports were coming out that civilians were in danger. There were claims that government forces were preparing to move into cities like Benghazi, and that if nothing was done, a lot of people could lose their lives. So the conversation quickly shifted from this is a protest to this is a humanitarian crisis. And once that label enters the conversation, it opens the door for international action. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973. Now, this was a big deal. because this resolution allowed for a no-fly zone over Libya and all necessary measures to protect civilians. That phrase, all necessary measures, sounds simple, but in reality, it gives a lot of room for action. And just 2 days later, on March 19, 2011, military operations began, led mainly by countries like the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. Airstrikes started hitting Libyan targets, missiles were launched, defense systems were destroyed, and very quickly, this changed everything. Because now, this was no longer just Libyans fighting Libyans. This was a government facing both internal rebellion and external military pressure at the same time. Now think about how difficult that is to survive. On one side, you have armed groups inside your country. On the other side, you have some of the most powerful militaries in the world. That balance is almost impossible to maintain. And slowly, Gaddafi's control started weakening. City by city, territory started slipping away. Rebel forces began advancing, and every time the government tried to respond, airstrikes made it harder. Because while the mission was officially about protecting civilians, critics started asking questions. They began to wonder, was this really just about protection, or was there something else behind it? Because if you look at the outcome, the intervention didn't just protect civilians, it shifted the balance of power completely. It gave the rebels a major advantage, and it pushed Gaddafi closer and closer to the edge. By mid-2011, his grip on Libya was no longer what it used to be. Tripoli, the capital, was under pressure. Government structures were weakening, and for the first time in over 40 years, it became clear that his rule might actually end. Now imagine that, a man who had held power for decades, now watching everything collapse within months. And at that point, this wasn't just about politics anymore, this was survival. Because once a leader falls into a situation like this, there are no guarantees, no clear exit, and no safe landing. And that's what made the final phase of the story so intense. Because by the time we get closer to October 2011, Gaddafi was no longer leading a country. He was on the run, moving from place to place, trying to stay hidden, trying to survive. And when it gets to that stage, the end is usually not peaceful. It's chaotic, unpredictable, and sometimes it raises more questions than answers. Because now we are getting very close to the moment we are trying to pinpoint. The moment he was found, captured, and killed. But even in that final moment, the story is still not as simple as it looks, because the biggest question still remains. In all of this chaos, who actually delivered the final blow? Was it really just the crowd or something more? By October 2011, everything had already fallen apart. The government was gone, major cities were no longer under control, and Muammar Gaddafi was no longer a leader. At this point, he was a man on the run, moving from place to place, trying to avoid being captured. Even after losing Tripoli, Gaddafi didn't leave Libya. He stayed, and that decision alone changed everything, because it meant one thing: sooner or later, he was going to be found. October 20th, 2011. It was early in the morning. Gaddafi was in a convoy leaving the city of Sirte, which had become one of his last strongholds. He wasn't alone. There were loyalists with him, security, vehicles moving together, trying to escape, but they didn't make it far, because as that convoy moved, it was spotted from above. NATO aircraft were monitoring the situation, and within a short time, airstrikes were launched. The convoy was hit, vehicles were destroyed, everything was scattered, and in that moment, the situation completely broke down. People started running, trying to hide and trying to survive, and Gaddafi ended up taking cover in a drainage pipe. Now just pause there for a second. A man who ruled a country for over 40 years, now hiding underground, trying to escape. That alone tells you how much had changed. It didn't take long before rebel fighters started searching the area. They found him, pulled him out. He was alive, confused, and surrounded. And from that moment, everything became chaotic. Videos started recording, people shouting, pulling, pushing, no clear control. There was no structure, just a crowd and a fallen leader in the middle of it. Now this is where things become unclear, because different accounts exist. Some say he was beaten, some say he was shot during the chaos, some say he was already fatally injured before that moment. But one thing is certain, he didn't leave that situation alive. Officially, the narrative was simple. Gaddafi was captured by rebel fighters and killed during the process. End of story. But if you look closer, questions start to come up, because remember, that convoy was hit by NATO airstrikes first. So already, external forces were involved in stopping him. Then you have the chaos during his capture with no clear, controlled arrest, no trial, no formal process, just a sudden end. And for someone who was such a major global figure, that kind of ending feels unfinished. That's why even today, people still ask, was it really just the crowd, or was his fate already decided the moment he was found? So who really killed him? The honest answer is, it depends on how you look at it. If you look at the final moment alone, then yes, it was the rebel fighters who captured him, and in that chaos, he died. But if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, then it becomes more complicated, because without the uprising inside Libya, the international intervention, the NATO airstrikes, that final moment might never have happened. So was it one person, one group, or a chain of events that all led to the same ending? And this is where we have to be honest. There isn't one simple answer, because history like this is never clean. To some people, Gaddafi was a dictator who lost power. To others, he was a leader who was removed. And based on who you listen to, the story changes. But one thing nobody can deny is this: his fall wasn't just sudden. It was the result of years of tension, decisions, conflicts, and power struggles all coming together at one moment in time. So when people ask who killed Gaddafi, the real answer is, it wasn't just about who pulled the trigger. It was about everything that led up to that moment. And maybe the better question is, was his fall inevitable, or was it something that could have gone differently?